now. So we'll go ahead and get started. 2 minutes past the hour. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live training. Oh, I've got so many things open now. I'm getting you ready for that advanced certification prep. This is part 5 of our 6-part series, so we are nearing the end. Before we go ahead and get started, just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First of all is that I am sorry, I am fighting off a cold, so if I sound a little congested or sniffly, I apologize. It's that time of year with late spring when those colds go around, right? So pardon me for my sniffling that you might hear on the line. I do apologize for that. We also have a couple of other things to mention is that we are scheduled here for about an hour or so today. I don't anticipate us, I say this every time, I don't anticipate us going that long for about an hour, and today I think I actually do mean it. For those of you who have been on these calls before, we always go a few minutes past the hour, but today I think we'll actually get it under that hour from start to finish, so woohoo, that is progress. We do record these calls, so as soon as you guys came into this call, you were put on mute. I'd like to keep it that way if possible, so that way we preserve the nice integrity of the audio for this particular call. If you do have any questions, or you want additional clarification, or you want to add any of your insights, inputs, tips, tricks, suggestions, whatever you may have to share, I encourage you to use the chat functionality of the WebEx or the Q&A to communicate with me, Training Services, also known as Christine Bonthia, Senior Instructional Designer here at Alteryx. I apologize, I did not introduce myself at first. We did confirm it's working, so thank you for that. So just so you know, you can always get in contact with me that way for today's call. I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll answer any questions that come up as they're particularly relevant. Otherwise, at maybe some of the transitions, I can address some of the questions that come in, and we certainly will have time at the end to cover anything or address any questions that we didn't get to during the presentation today. Because we do record these sessions, that means that we do make these available for you later on. So as soon as we get this call and the video rendered from today, we'll go ahead and we'll post it back up on community, the live training post for today's session back in Alteryx Academy on the community site. So that way you can access this again, you can revisit this as you continue studying for that advanced exam, or if any of your colleagues today weren't able to make this call, they will have access to it later on as well. So let's go ahead and get started here. Oh, there we go. All right. So our agenda, first we cover some of those upcoming trainings we have, just a review of the calendar for the next couple of months. Go ahead and jump into some background for today's training. And then we have a lot of key concepts. We're going to be strictly PowerPoint today. We're actually not even using Designer at all. We're just going to be really focusing on some foundational knowledge and concepts about some of the tools that come along with the parsing and the additional kind of more advanced preparation section that you can expect on this advanced exam. So at the end there, I'll share some preparation resources that I've kind of picked out from the community for you that might help answer or give you some additional practice on some of the concepts we're talking about today. Just a little plug for community first before we move on. If you haven't been to the community already, I highly encourage you to pay us a visit there. Sign in, geekoutcommunity.alteryx.com. It's more than just training. It's more than just Academy. There are endless resources in terms of discussion forums, blog posts, networking opportunities. It's a really cool place to really dive in to some of these concepts and some of these materials on all areas of Alteryx, whether that's Designer, whether that's Server, whether that's Connect, whether that's Promote, whatever it might be. There's a resource out there for everybody. And if knowledge is really what you're after, then we've got you covered there too. Academy is a part of the community where we have all of our training materials that we make available to you in the forms of interactive lessons. We have live trainings just like this one every Tuesday. Weekly challenges, which we post on Monday. This week's was particularly fun. It's all about diamonds and using the R tool to read in a data set. So that's kind of a fun one. And then, of course, product certification, which is really, today's session is really geared toward getting you ready for that advanced certification exam. So all that and more you can find at academy.alteryx.com. I want to highlight the calendar for some of our upcoming live trainings. Here we are, April 16th, with this part 5 of the Advanced Cert Prep sessions. Remember, this is a 6-part series, so here we are looking at April 30th at the end of this series, where we'll have our certification program manager, Elizabeth Bonnell, on this session to really give you a sense of what you can expect on test day. What are some of those helpful tips and tricks, things you should have open, things you should know about for when you actually sit down to take the exam itself. In between that, we've got another chapter of Born to Solve. That'll be next week. If you haven't tuned into some of those sessions already, they're really a lot of fun. And I say that because I get to be the guinea pig for a lot of these, where I get to have a problem put in front of me, and you get to watch us solve it live. It's usually me and my colleague Joe Miller who helps kind of walk me through what that problem-solving process looks like, where you get to watch people just like you, so presumably me, or someone else, get a problem thrown right there in front of them. You get to watch that problem-solving process in action, from understanding the problem to making some mistakes along the way, all the way to maybe learning a couple new tips or tricks about watching someone else solve a problem right in front of you, things that they do differently from you. There's always something to learn no matter what level you're at, right? And then here in May, we're getting ready for Inspire, which is coming up in June, which is very exciting. We are all very excited about this. But that means that in May, we're going to be starting to scale back some of our live training offerings. So that way we have more time to dedicate to Inspire. So we have 2 sessions that we have planned for May, one of which early May, May 7th, will simply be a getting started with Designer. So for those of you or you know someone in your company who just started using Designer, this is the perfect session for them. We want to kind of get them onboarded and ramped up quickly with Designer in this session. And then on the 21st, we're doing something that we haven't done before, which is for those of you who are planning on attending Inspire in Nashville in June, which if you haven't purchased your ticket already, I highly encourage you to do so, especially if you want to sign up for training. We are filling up like crazy. So if you want to be in on some of those training sessions, I highly encourage you to sign up very, very soon. But on the 21st, we're going to go ahead and do a external-facing Inspire Know Before You Go. What should you know about training in particular at Inspire to help you get the most out of it, to help you be the most successful? What should you check off on your list? What should you make sure you have installed before you even show up for training at Inspire? So that'll be on the 21st. We'll talk about all things from the training sessions that we're going to be covering, what you can expect in terms of, what you should bring with you, all the way to what kind of certifications and what kind of new things are we offering with training this year that you haven't seen in the past. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that, but as always, we do record those sessions. So if you can't make it or you can't join us on the 21st, that information will still be available for you on Community. So some background for today's training in particular. Here we are towards the end of getting you ready for that advanced certification exam. We've already gone through spatial analytics, building macros, creating analytic apps, reporting, and finally here we are at advanced prep and parsing. One interesting thing I think to note about this particular area of the exam, just some insider knowledge here, is that insider prep and parsing, right? These are tools that probably you work with most commonly. I would say of all these tools that we've already covered here in this advanced exam, for those of you who are not comfortable, with spatial might not necessarily be in your wheelhouse. Macros might not necessarily be either. Same with apps and interface tools, same with reporting. But I would say that most people who take this advanced exam have at some point or another touched every single one of these tools that we talk about or that we test on here in this advanced prep and parsing section. So we're talking about things like the multi-field and multi-row formula tools. Probably almost by this point when you're an advanced user, you're probably using those in almost every workflow you build at this point, right? Advanced functions with the formula tool. Parsing, so you're looking at things like RegEx. I would say that this is probably the section that people tend to do the best on in the whole exam, simply because these are probably the tools that we're interacting with the most. However, I think what gets people about these particular tools is that the way that you use these tools is probably, I'm not going to say one-dimensional, but you probably use them in limited ways, right? You probably interact with them in very kind of predictable, repeatable ways. Maybe you only tend to use the parse function of the RegEx tool, or maybe you really kind of rely on one or two kind of riffs on a single formula really in the multi-row formula tool. So really where the power of kind of testing on these particular tools comes in is knowing all those little possibilities about what you can do in all those different configuration options of these tools. This particular section of the exam really lends itself well in terms of test questions to those types of, if you think back to the core exam, if you've taken that already, you see those types of questions that have sequences of tools, right? Which tool could create this type of output, or which combinations of tools could create the values in column 2 or whatever it might be, right? These tools is where you're going to see a lot of those kind of practical type questions, which can be tricky because now you're kind of faced with those situations of imagining what's possible, right? You don't necessarily have the time in this exam to go through and recreate every configuration option in these tools to try and figure out, well, what could possibly make this answer, right? It's really becoming a very reliant on recall in terms of what are the different configuration options of these particular tools and how can they be paired with other tools to create different outcomes. So that's kind of my take on this particular section of the test and why I think it tends to be easier for people, but also why it can be deceptively very tricky. These questions can take you quite a bit of time. So that being said, some of the concepts I do want to cover today are more focused around some of the very specific functionalities of these tools or very specific uses of these tools that I think tend to trip people up the most, though some of them being the differences and the idiosyncrasies between the multi-row and the multi-field formula tools. Second being date-time parsing in particular. Date-time parsing is and can be very tricky, and it can be very time-consuming. And then finally, RegEx. As promised, we're going to kind of give you a little bit of a crash course, if you will, not necessarily on RegEx and creating regular expressions, so we will kind of talk to that, but really those different output methods that you have available to you in the RegEx tool and how those different output methods, first of all, what they do and how they work, but then the different outputs you can expect from those different types of methods, right? And of course, finally, always the emphasis of how you can be tested on these items. So as usual, practice quiz time. So take this moment to either grab your computer, open up Notepad so you can record your answers, just grab a sheet of paper real fast so you can write down the answers. We've got another little 8-question quiz of things to test yourself on. And then at the end here, we'll go ahead and review these answers on this call. So go ahead and give people a few more seconds to go ahead and grab something to write with, grab something to record with, before we go ahead and get started. All right. So question 1, like I said, we've got about 8 questions. I'll go ahead and give you about, let's give you about 20 seconds or so on the clock to answer each question. I don't want to take up too much time here, but I want to give you probably kind of a reasonable amount of time to think about what this might look like on the actual advanced exam. You'll have a little more time than 20 seconds, but all right, so question 1. Which tool allows you to change the data type of an existing column? Okay. Question 2. Which of the following formulas below would create a series that would double each value of the value in the column count from the previous row? Okay. Question 3. Which of the following tools cannot output more rows than were input into that tool? So which one cannot create any more rows than were in its initial input? All right, question 4. In which tool or tools, so you can select multiple here, can you specify the separator for concatenated values? There can be multiple answers here. Okay, question 5. Which of the following is not an output method in the RegEx tool? Okay, question 6. Which regular expression would produce the output in the column field 1 underscore matched? So based on the values in field 1, which regular expression could you use to get those values in field 1 underscore matched? Question 7. Matching. match the date time specifier on the left, so those options A, B, C, D with the percent signs on the letters, to its definition, which is there on the right. And finally, question 8, last one for today. Which expression below will return the value shown in the column output? Based on the values in field 1, which expression will give you the values in output? Okay. So hold on to your answers for now. We'll review those towards the end. But let's go ahead and talk about some of those fundamentals first on prep and parsing. So you can see from those questions, I tried to model them as best I could on some real questions that you could see over on the advanced exam. And they cover all sorts of things, like I mentioned, from the other blue tools, right? The multi-field and multi-formula tools, among others. There are a lot of other blue tools that we could definitely test on as well. But all the way over to parsing, right? What parsing being including both date time and things like with RegEx. So let's go ahead and just dive in there. Let's start with the top. Let's start with some of those blue tools, which is probably something a little bit more accessible to everyone. I'm sure we've probably all used those at some point by now in a workflow. But let's talk about, they're easy to get confused, and they're easy to they have some very subtle differences, especially in their configuration windows, that are really important, though, for some of these types of questions, right? So let's just visualize first this multi-field formula tool. The multi-field formula tool, in a nutshell, allows you to apply an expression to multiple fields or columns of data at a time. So for example, if your task is to just find all these numeric fields that have null values in them, replace them with a value of 0 instead, right? One expression that you would write in your normal formula tool would be if is null field, then 0, else field, right? And if. But in the multi-field formula tool, what you get to use instead of just a field name or a single individual column, is that you get to actually apply this to multiple columns at once by using that current field value, right? So let's just take a look at what this looks like. Well, here's your current field. The current field noticed in your numeric column, which cost presumably is numeric, right? But that's always something that you should check in the metadata first. If it's null, then replace with 0. If it's null, replace with 0. Otherwise, use the value in current fields. So you can see as it goes through and evaluates, it goes through with this multi-field formula, it goes through all of your columns kind of left to right and then top to bottom to evaluate this expression, right? So it's always looking at that current field and that current value in that column and looking at that expression and evaluating it against it. What's really cool about this is that it allows you to make mass changes across your data set, right? Some really important things to note, though, about this multi-field formula tool is how you can select the fields that you want to apply it to. You do have, remember in that configuration window here at the top, is you do get to select the types of columns to which you apply this expression. So using a drop-down menu, you can select fields by type. right? Or you can select fields manually by name using that checkbox menu. So you could say, instead of all numeric columns, I could just say, only apply it to these 3 out of my 10 possible numeric columns, right? So there's a very manual component to the types of columns to which you can apply these different expressions. You can change each field in its current column or create new fields. So this could be a nice, interesting question, I guess you could say, for instead of things like that question that we had in the practice quiz, instead of how many, which tools cannot output additional rows, which tools maybe can or cannot output additional columns. Because there is this nice checkbox there for when you apply these new formulas. Are you creating a brand new column and copying it to an output field, or are you overriding the values in their current columns? And really that configuration option is just the checkbox. If you can see my mouse here, it's right here, this copy output fields, and add whatever I want. The default is new underscore typically, as a prefix or a suffix. So looking at column or looking at configuration options like that, again, think of those very possible types of practical questions where you see sequences of tools in a row, and then maybe at the end you see the metadata, or you see just in the results window, like you have X number of columns now. This could be a very interesting tool to incorporate into understanding how the dimensions of your data can possibly change. What other thing you can really test on that's kind of cool here is changing the data type. We had a question, remember, in that practice quiz of, can you actually change the data type of an existing column or the column in which you are working with? In the multi-field formula, it is possible. You can, when you're even just overwriting values in those current columns, you can actually change the output data type of that column after these expressions have been applied. You can use this checkbox here, if you can see my mouse, is change output type to use the drop down here, and you can choose strings. You can choose doubles. You can choose Booleans, right? And set those sizes if that data type allows you to. So there's kind of this weird select tool-like functionality that exists in different ways and in different facets here in this multi-field formula tool, when that changing the data type is a really neat one. And I think it's one that lends itself very well to some test questions, right? Because in other tools like that apply expression, so think of like the formula tool or even like the multi-row formula tool, which we'll get to shortly, is that you cannot really change the data type of an existing column. If I'm writing an expression to change the value in column 1, in a formula tool, I can't change that outgoing data type, right? Because you're kind of locked in. You'd have to create a brand new column. Whereas in this multi-field formula tool, that option is all of a sudden available to you, much like with a select tool in itself. You also have, with this multi-field formula tool, is you have a couple of different options for the variables that you can use in your expressions, right? You've got these expressions using special variables that, like, if you expand that menu here under current field, you have a couple different options. I think you have current field, you have current name, and current data type. So you really can be working on a couple of different planes here. You can be working with data values, you can be working with data types, and you can be working with field names or column names of all those individual areas. You also have, in this expandable menu here, the original fields. So you can work with multiple columns at a time, and you can also write just one single column, a single variable, into your expression as well as constants. So you have those same options available like a formula tool. So this multi-field formula tool, very powerful. Allows you to work in kind of multiple dimensions of your data, and allows you also to both dynamically select data in terms of data types you want to work with, or manually select data in terms of which columns do I actually want to apply this expression to. I would say that for me, when I look at this tool, those are the elements that I see that are very testable and also very practical to put on a type of exam to make sure that somebody knew the differences between this tool and, say, the multi-row formula tool, which let's get to that now. So the multi-row formula tool, rather than kind of working just horizontally, like I would say the multi-field formula really does. Remember, as you saw it kind of move from left to right for every column, and then down a row, and then left to right again. The multi-row formula tool is, wow, like this tool is really, really powerful, and it can work in a lot of different dimensions. It's almost like playing chess sometimes with your data to figure out how you want to move or how you want to kind of isolate or capture a value that you want to use in an expression to refer to within that expression that you're writing. So let's take a look first before we dive into the configuration option of how this tool works in comparison to that multi-field or even just the normal formula tool. So let's say you have this goal, right, to rank stores for every month using this multi-row formula tool. So you want to make sure that you are grouping by month, right? So you have months of November and December, and these ranks should essentially start over when the month changes. When values don't exist, let's say that they are, 0, you should make them 0. If there's no value, make it 0. And your logic should always be that row minus 1 of the store rank plus 1. That's how your sequence is going to be applied. That's how your rank is going to be calculated. Always look at when we say minus 1, it's the row above me, right? It's the row that came before me. So take that row and then add 1 to that value, kind of like almost like a running total or something like that in a way. So let's take a look at how this is going to work. First, let's go ahead and get our data in order here. Right, we want to use rank the stores, let's say, by sales. We want to make sure that our top performing store, our store that's worth 600 units, is ranked number 1. And then we want to make sure that the next least selling item is, number 2 and then number 3. And then when we get to December again, we want to start over. We want to go number 1, number 2, okay? So let's take a look first at how we're going to separate this out. First is, of course, to group it. Isolate those groups. Where should your sequences and your, let's say your count, for example, where should that sequence start and where should it end? Should it kind of bleed over through different groups, or do you actually need to kind of chunk this out into different blocks where this sequence should happen? The multi-row formula tool allows you to enable grouping, one really important thing that a lot of these other tools don't have, right? So again, another very testable element of this tool. Remember that when you have, you're kind of working in a couple different dimensions here. So let's just take this first row, active row, letter A. You're always working with an active row and rows that come before it, and rows that come after it. Before is always going to be on top of it, so towards the top of your data set, and a row that comes after it, plus 1, is always going to be rows that come below, okay? So that's a really important distinction to make too, is which way is up and which way is down. When you're looking at an active row, you're always evaluating either is the value in this active row with reference to the row before, the row after, or X number of rows above, or X number of rows after. This is how your calculation is going to be applied, right? So we've got this active row. We want to make sure that with this calculation, that active row A is always, that value is going to be calculated from the value of store rank from before it plus 1. However, note that you have a little bit of a problem here. Is that active row, when your first row is number 1, essentially, the row before it is 0, okay? So in this case, this works out nicely because we're taking that row minus 1 store rank, so 0 plus 1. That's how we're going to get number 1. I think that's important to remember, is that when your top row of data there, that row minus 1 value is always 0. Okay, so if you're like, let's say, multiplying or dividing by row minus 1, that first row of data is always going to give you a bit of a problem because you're either going to come back with a 0 because of, 2 times the value of row minus 1 before. Well, 2 times 0 is 0, right? So that's not really going to get you the value that you need. Or let's say dividing by 0, right? You're going to get some null values and things that aren't possible. So always keep that in mind, is that that first row, row minus 1, is a 0 value. So you've got to either do something in your logic to account for that one specific row, or somehow in your calculation make sure you're adding 1, or you're making sure that you're not starting off on a 0-based kind of count, right? So, store rank number 1. The multi-row formula, as you can see these arrows move down, it's going to work from top to bottom, okay? So it's going to first evaluate row number 1 with this expression you write, and then it's going to evaluate row number 2. Active row is now row number 2. Well, now you've got actual values in store rank for the row above, but not necessarily the row below yet. So now this expression of row minus 1, store rank plus 1 is really going to make more sense, because now I've got an active row in the row minus 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2. And 2 gets inserted there into the third row. And it just keeps moving down. Now where things kind of tend to get more interesting is when this grouping starts over, right? So now we've moved down in our data set, but remember with grouping enabled, based on month, is that now we're essentially at row 1 again. And remember what happens with row 1. Well, row 1 essentially has a 0 value. So we've got to kind of start over here with number 1. And then we're going to move down with number 2 to kind of fill in all of this data. So that store rank here, I think what's really important to recognize is that you can work in terms of row minus 1 up and down between kind of a current row, but that number doesn't always have to be 1, right? So you could be looking up 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 rows above or below to capture a specific value. You can also be looking at different columns. You don't always have to be looking at this column store rank. I could be calling values from the column store name, or I could be calling values from another column that I might have called, total number of units sold, whatever it might be. So I could be looking horizontally in different columns and up and down. It's really, really powerful. So let's take a look at this configuration window for this particular tool. So remember that with this tool as well, I do have the option to overwrite columns. So those values in those current columns that I'm working with update an existing field, or I can create new fields. So again, thinking about different outcomes of how this tool plays in a workflow, right? Where can I expand the dimensions of my data in terms of number of columns, in terms of number of rows that I'm creating? This is a really cool option to test on as well. You need to specify the number of rows that are available to you in an expression, right? So by default, the number of rows that you can look up or down is always going to be 1. But if you ever need that to be more, let's say you need 12 or something like that, you need to set that. You need to put that in manually, as well as decide for values of rows that don't exist, how to treat those. So if those rows are there, let's say, remember row 1, you want to look 1 row above that, it's going to be 0. Well, it could be null, could be empty, could be some other value that you specify as well. So that's also something to take into consideration. Multi-row formula, something really cool about it that other tools do not have is that grouping mechanism, right? So something else to also keep in mind. For the variables, remember that you have row minus n, current field name, and row plus n. So that way you can be looking at those different dimensions. Every column that you select, or every column in your data set, will have a row minus n and a row plus n as well as the current one. So you can be working horizontally and vertically. Something that you might want to remember with this particular tool is that while you can create additional columns here, is that this particular tool, the number of rows that you put into this is the same number of rows you're going to get out. Now, the values in those columns might be different, but your number of rows, so the vertical kind of dimension of your data, will not change from this particular tool. Let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about some of the date time. Before I do that though, I do want to mention there are lots of other Blue tools, right, in this tool palette that make great candidates for test questions. Things like all the different varieties of those sample tools that you have available to you. Different ways that you can use the tile tool, generate rows, all sorts of things that do exist there in that prep tool palette that could easily count as advanced. I chose to just call out these particular multi-row, multi-field formula tools today for those different idiosyncrasies that I pointed out in terms of how they play with creating new fields and kind of the different configuration options that you have there. I highly encourage you to review some of those other Blue tools that you have, as well as some of those other tools that just exist in the transform tool palette, summarize, crosstab, transform. Those never go out of style in terms of test questions, as well as some of the tools in the join tool palette, which we're not going to really cover today. But we did have some quiz questions on them, so we will review some of those concepts as we review those answers toward the end. But I just want to make sure that I highlight that we're not going to be covering that because I think that date-time parsing, for example, is definitely worth some practice today. So date-time parsing, we do have quite a few resources available for you to study date-time parsing, but I would say that this is probably one of the trickier things to do in terms of parsing and data prep. So let's just recap real quick some of the basics, right? What is the Alteryx date-time format? That's the 4-digit year, dash 2-digit month, dash 2-digit day, space, 2-digit hour, colon, 2-digit minute, 2-digit seconds. You format dates and times, so that by default is an Alteryx date time data type. It is a very unique data type. You have date data types, you have time data types, and you have date time data types. You format data and parse data using specifiers and separators. Specifiers are a percent sign with a letter that is case sensitive, which kind of acts as like a code to indicate some of the information regarding date time, such as the full name of the month, right, that this date happens to be in. Percent capital B means August. Well, it means length of the full month. In this case, this date in August. You have percent A. That's an abbreviated version of the day of the week that this date is. Percent J. This is the 225th day of the year. It's kind of like these cool codes for information that exists about this date that you don't actually see anywhere necessarily in that date time format, okay? So specifiers are those percent case-sensitive letter combinations. The separators are just simply things to insert between these specifiers to format this string. So things like the dashes that you see, or spaces, or commas, or slashes, or whatever it might be, right? That's what we call a separator. And if there's one piece of advice that I could give you to have open on test day, it would be the help documentation for the formula tool itself. And I will show you specifically what I'm talking about. So this is the help documentation. I just went ahead and typed into the Google formula tool Alteryx help documentation. Pulled me right up here. You are going to want to have this open. This is the functions list that exist in the formula tool. Nice little descriptions everywhere on all those different types of functions that you have available into the formula tool, including the date time, specifiers, and separators. This specifiers little cheat sheet here is going to be so helpful to you because it lists out every single specifier as well as the output or its definition, what it means when you use it in a date time format or from date time parsing. This is going to help you with anything from the formula tool to the date time parse tool to, gosh, who knows what else it could help you with, but this is going to be very, very helpful for you. It's a really nice, quick lookup sheet. When we talk about date-time parsing, we can talk about this in a couple of different ways with a couple of different tools. And one is the date-time parse tool, which is found in that parse tool palette. It's green. It has two different conversion modes. You can go from a date-time data type, remember that 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, to a string. And you can also go from a string to a date. It's a nice little kind of two-way street there. Limitations to know about. It does consume and output only a single field of data that you select from this drop-down menu. This looks a little bit different. I didn't get quite the most updated configuration window. I apologize for that. But select the field that you want and then give it a brand new field name. You cannot overwrite the same column with the date time parse tool. Something to be careful about. If you do not see a format of an input string that looks like your data, with the configuration option that I do not have currently showing, is that you do have an option to set a custom format, which is where those specifiers and separators are going to come into play for you. It will also come into play when you're using or when you're performing date time parsing here in the formula tool, specifically with these two functions, date time format and date time parse. And it's important to know the difference between the two. Date time format function is really looking for you to go from a date time tool or date time data type to a string. And datetime parse is the opposite. It really wants you to go from a string format using separators and specifiers to get a date time out of it. One other reason I really wanted to pull up this formula tool help, which I just showed you, is to know that some specifiers are supported with one function and not another. So that could be another really important thing to take a look at. RegEx. We are just flying through this, and I apologize if I'm not getting to all the details here, but I do want to focus on the RegEx tool because this will come into play on the advanced exam. And a couple of items about it will come into play on the advanced exam. One is simply writing a regular expression. Do you know what some of those separators and specifiers actually mean? Do you know what period plus means versus period star? Do you know the difference between \d and \lowercase w? There are really some basic parts of writing a regular expression that you do need to know. And unfortunately, we don't have time today to kind of go into the crash course of RegEx in general. That's something that I think you would need to spend some time practicing and researching and learning. But what's really important here is that you do know how to write some basic regular expressions, or at least be able to decipher them on what they mean, especially in context of the different output methods that you can use in the RegEx tool. So RegEx tool configuration here on the right, just a real quick crash course here. If you have to choose a field to parse, and it's got to be a string, right? If it's numeric, it's not going to show up in this drop-down menu of fields that you can parse with a regular expression. It must be a string. You enter in a regular expression. You can use the library that is provided in Designer. If you expand this little drop-down menu here, if you can see my mouse in the regular expression box, there's a whole list of different things that you can use, and just click and insert into this regular expression text box, or you can just go for it and manually enter it yourself. But there is a nice little kind of cheat sheet library there for you. Then you have 4 different output methods that you can choose: replace, tokenize, parse, and match. And depending on the output method that you choose, this configuration option or this configuration window will change. So let's visit each of those different output methods. First one's going to be parsing, right? So here's your date. You have this date of October 12th, 2015. Let's write a regular expression first with parentheses to first indicate that we want to make a column, right? When we talk about marked groups, it's a set of open parentheses and close parentheses. And anytime with the parse method, I make a marked group, I'm going to create a brand new output column. So if I make 3, that means I'm going to make 3 columns. Very cool, right? In my regular expression, I do want to make sure I have all those separators, specifiers, because I'm writing a regular expression to essentially match and capture the different components of this string value to output. So for that first one, right, I want \d twice. And I have a couple of different ways to write that. I could do \d with curly brackets around a 2 to specify specifically 2 digits, or I could do \d plus, with those 2 digits. I have a couple of different ways I can do that. But anytime that this regular expression then finds that criteria or finds this combination of values that I've specified, it's just simply going to output them into these different columns and make this nice parsing, right? So parsing, something really important to note, is that you are or can create those multiple output columns. You also do in the configuration window have some nice options in terms of modifying those output data columns in terms of data types and sizes that you can change. You can also rename your output columns. Instead of regex out 1, regex out 2, regex out 3, you can actually change that to be month, day, and year. Okay? Matching. Things get a little bit different. Really, your goal here is to write a regular expression and evaluate, does this expression or does this value in the column emails, does it match this pattern? And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, well, I want to know about that. So let's go ahead and write a regular expression here. I'll just go ahead and click through so that way you can see some of these different things. So this expression that I'm writing is \d. \d is specifically a digit. Does this regular expression, does the value in the column emails match it? Well, no, not yet. When you match, you're either getting a true or false, and it's going to be deceptively. It's going to say true or false in the results menu, but it's actually a Boolean value. It's actually a 1 or a 0, okay? So let's keep modifying these expressions. And as you keep modifying these different expressions, you're going to start to see how the matches start to fall into place, right? So these different regular expressions, so one or more of any character followed by a digit followed by one or more of any character, we're starting to get these true or false values. And depending on how stringent your regex really needs to be or the type of match that you're looking for, you're going to choose to write these regular expressions in different ways. So that way you can really isolate, for example, in this second or in this final example here, is that does this have a time value in it? Is there a digit followed by a colon, 4 o'clock? Yes. That top one is true. It does match this expression, but that bottom one does not have a time in it, right? So it does not match. It is false. So you have a lot of flexibility with writing these expressions, and it really depends on what you want to get out of it in terms of match. Like I said before, you have one of two options. There's regex. It does match or it doesn't. It's true or it's false, right? What's deceptive about it is that you see true and false in the results window. The actual data type of that column is a Boolean value. So that is something that can be tricky and also lends itself very well to some interesting test questions, right, in terms of a string of tools that I could use. Like, for example, if I wanted to have like a regex tool with match, and then the following tool would be a formula tool that, what's the correct expression that could be written with the value in this column? Well, it would be if column regex match 1, whatever equals true, it would be does it equal 1? Okay, so sneaky. Replacing, I'll go ahead and click through so that way it's recorded and you can watch this on your own time. But what's neat about replacing is that, like parsing, you're going to create these different marked groups to represent different parts of your data, and that there actually can be used as replacement text, right? These different marked groups, numbers 1, 2, and 3, can actually be used as text that can be rearranged, replaced. You can actually enter in manual text to actually replace as well. But what's really important there is that those marked groups, or that replacement text, is always going to be marked as a $sign number to indicate which marked group it is. Those marked groups are always going to go from left to right. Okay, so the first marked group here, this is actually number 1, number 2, and number 3. So just with this replacement text 3, $3, I'm getting the last marked group, so I'm actually only going to output whatever values that these represent, presumably the year in this case. And then finally, tokenize. We're blaring right through these. Tokenizing is really important for, think of it like splitting. And in fact, the configuration window will remind you quite a bit when you pick tokenize. It will remind you a lot of the text to columns tool itself. It'll give you the option to split to columns or split to rows. And one other really tricky thing is that when you make this token, right, it's going to go ahead and evaluate, okay, where do I finally match? Where do I finally match? Output and break. Output and break into separate columns or into separate rows. This token that you're writing in with this regular expression is essentially the pattern that things need to match. If it does not match, it gets output as null. And every time it finds that match, it's going to split a column into, or split that data into different columns, like the text to columns tool, or split it into rows, right? So I was going to make a point, but I'll revisit it when we review those test questions in terms of what tools could possibly give you more columns than you started with or more rows than you started with. Well, this is a really great way to end up with more rows than you started with. Okay, so quiz review with our few remaining minutes. Based on what we've covered today, some questions, right? You might want to pull up your answers here fast so that way we can review how you did. Is which tool allows you to change the data type of an existing column? And the answer is that multi-field formula tool. Remember, that's one of the few tools that actually allows you to overwrite the data type of an existing column of data that you are working with and actively applying an expression to. Remember that with the multi-row formula tool, if you want to essentially double the value from the previous row, that you're going to have to account for the fact that for that first row of data, row minus 1 is equal to 0. So in this case, the answer is C, because for that first row of data, to make a double of essentially that row, you need to change that value to a 1 before you can start applying that 2 times the value that comes before it. The answer B is often the one that's chosen because you see automatically, well, 2 times the row that comes before it. Great. But remember that that's just going to create a series of zeros for you because it's always going to be just looking at the row above it is always going to be 0. It's going to be 0, and that will propagate throughout your data. Question 3, which of the following tools cannot output more rows than were input into the tool? A, generate rows seems like definitely that should be able to create more rows than you started with, right? It's in the name. 2, RegEx, that tokenize method, right? Gives you that split to columns like functionality so that way you can create more rows than you originally started with. And join, I think if you, by this point, if you used the join tool, you've definitely gone through the mental gymnastics of figuring out why you've ballooned your data into way more many rows than you've ever started with. So the answer here is C. Whatever the number of records that come in, the number of rows that go into that multi-row formula tool should be the same number of rows that you come out with. Stuff we didn't really cover today, but I think it's important to let you know that there are and could be test questions on this, right? In which tool or tools can you specify the separator for concatenated values? Well, first you have to know which tools that are listed here, which tools do support concatenation. And the answers here are summarize and crosstab. And in both of these tools, you can actually specify the separator you want to use for concatenated values. By default, it's going to be a comma, but you can change that. You can change that to a comma space. You can change that to a pipe. You can change that to whatever you want it to be. And number 5, which of the following is not an output method in the RegEx tool? Tokenize, match, and parse are all options for you in the RegEx tool. Count matches is a RegEx function that exists in the formula tool, okay? So it's not an option in the RegEx tools configuration window itself, but count matches, there's a RegEx underscore count matches function that exists in the formula tool. A little bit of a trick here to kind of test if you knew some of those different codes for regular expressions, but which regular expression would produce the output in the column field underscore matched. And what you're really looking for here is B, is that you're mixing both representations of specifiers in terms of, \D or \W, whatever you might be looking for, period star, but that you can also mix those with literals. In this case, 14 is actually a literal. So all these mountains in Colorado that are over 14,000 feet have been marked as true. And then anything that does not have a 14 in it has been marked as false. Question 7, matching those date time specifiers to its definition. This is exactly why I encourage you to have that function sheet open and readily available when you're taking the test, because more power to you if you have totally memorized. I definitely do not. So this is a really great way for questions like these, important to test the knowledge, but it's also important to test the knowledge that you know where to find it, not necessarily that you know it off the top of your head right away. Right? So I've gone ahead and matched up those specifiers on the left there to their meanings on the right. And finally, question 8. Which expression below will return the value shown in the column output? So this is really testing the difference of, do you know the difference between date-time format and date-time parse and when it's appropriate to use each of those? And then do you know the difference, or do you know the combinations of specifiers that can be used to create different outputs, in which case this particular one is A. Some helpful preparation resources, and we just hit 12 o'clock. Helpful things to learn. If today some of the topics that we covered today are a little rusty for you, we do have plenty of resources for you to go ahead and review and practice before you start that advanced exam. We do have a couple live trainings, one especially on Introduction to Regular Expressions, where we do really take some time to dive into RegEx. That's in terms of writing RegEx, what some of those different symbols and different syntax elements really mean, and then of course those different output methods for the RegEx tool in particular. We do have a whole session focused on just parsing dates and times as well, which if that area is causing you some concern, definitely encourage you to revisit that one. It's always good to practice these concepts because just knowing them, you need to be able to practice them and be able to put them into practice fairly quickly for this advanced exam. So I've picked out a couple of weekly challenges that we have that have to do with a lot of these topics that we talked about today and some of those different creative ways to use those advanced preparation and parsing tools. And then there's always more to learn. We do have a lot of tool mastery articles. In fact, there's a really great one on the RegEx tool, I think. It's one of the ones that I have bookmarked for myself. Tool mastery articles on RegEx, the RegEx tool, and all those different kind of configuration options that are available there. We have lots of knowledge-based articles, tool masteries, and EngineWorks blogs. So kind of more of the use case scenario of what you're going after. Some of those blogs may be really interesting reading for you. And that brings us to the end of today's session. We do have a couple more minutes. So let me go ahead and just make sure that anything that I can answer came in through the chat. Otherwise, we will go ahead and wrap the session. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next week.